I think we've all come here because there's that student nature of us that seeks to learn. I'm learning so much tonight. For example, I learned that one of the first Lone Rangers was African American. So I'm feeling really ennobled right now to steer this thing home. What we know of history to a very large degree is informed by mythology. And like many boys my age growing up, we remember watching Westerns. And on Saturdays, I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. On Saturday afternoons, with my grandfather, I would watch Tarzan. Now, I know that's not Western. And then I would watch Gunsmoke. And I was introduced to Gene Autry, Roy and Dale Rogers. Any of those names ring a bell? John Wayne, the Lone Ranger, and his friend Tonto. And unbeknownst to me at the time, they became my heroes, and to a large degree, they informed my own understanding of life, of society, certainly the Wild Wild West. This conversation is about the code of the West, values and conflict. What was the code? How was the code formed, and by whom was it formed? And what we know of the code in the Western narrative, for the most part, well, is it more legend than truth? And as interested students, all of us in this room, how do we reconcile with myth and reality? Here we have four incredible scholars of American West. You can read their bios in the program. They're very prolific. They're all great writers and historians of note. I'll introduce you to them briefly. We have Stephen Aaron. Stephen Aaron, sometimes pronounced Aaron.
Not by anyone in the Aaron family.
He's a professor of history at the University of California. We have Ned Blackhawk, who's a professor of history and American studies at Yale. We have Petty Limerick, who has an incredible vibe with Mr. Koch here. We saw that earlier. She's a faculty director and chair of the board of the Center for American West at the University of Colorado Boulder. And we have Roger McGrath, who's a former professor at UCLA and who's appeared in hundreds of documentaries, and like our other three panelists, is quite a prolific writer. And I'm the student. So Steve, I'd like to start with you. What I know of you, what I've read of you for the most part, would suggest that you might take issue with the title that we have here, Values and Conflict, the Code of the West. What are we really trying to get at here?
Say what? That's my Dan Coates moment.
Oh, that's so funny.
Thought
That's
for
right.
this
That's
audience.
special. That is
Here
so
on this stage.
On this stage, we can give you it again.
I expect the performance to be just as good. All right.
Well, I don't think the national media is quite as focused today as on that one. But no, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I guess if I were titling the panel, I probably wouldn't, and this actually gets to what Dr. Koch.
Yes,
Dr. Koch said in his remarks about the challenges of sort of sorting perception and reality from one another, and or as you put it, myth and history. And I guess I would have titled the panel The Code of the Western rather than The Code of the West, because it seems to me so much of what we associate with that code comes out of Westerns sort of dating from the 19th century in dime novels and in Buffalo Bill Wild West shows, and then in cinema and television through the 20th century. And I think so much of what we associate is entwined or is entangled with the mythic West, which is not to say that the myth of the West exists entirely apart from the history of the West. I think in important ways they're entangled and become very difficult to sort from one another. I worked for many years. I shared an appointment, split my appointment from UCL in the Autry Museum in Los Angeles, please, which is probably one of the museums that came courting your collection. Well, we should have. We will. But you know, I think one of the things we try to do there is sort of look at the ways in which the history of the West and the mythic West are sort of entwined with one another and how they are inseparable. I work, for example, one of my books was about Daniel Boone, who was a legend in his own time, and in some ways then tried to craft his own persona around the mythic character that had been created about him. So it is difficult to distinguish the myth from the reality. That said, as I said, I think some of the values and themes that we associate with the Code of the West really are more appropriately designated as the Code of the Western. I do want to put in one more plug for Gene Autry, though. I can't stand up to show you this because we're mic'd up in such a way that if I stand up, everything will go awry. But there's a Gene Autry shirt. But there's Gene Autry's Cowboy Code for you, which actually, as codes go, if those of you who are not familiar with it, but since you plugged it a moment ago.
Could you turn it this way? Yeah? Okay. That's a lot of code.
Put it in front of
There's
me.
a lot.
Okay.
Okay.
Roger, I don't mean to cover you, but this is a pretty good code to live by. Not a bad one.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was the
Gene
Ten
Autry's-
Commandments, and then there was Gene Autry's code.
Gene Autry's Cowboy Code. The cowboy must never shoot first, hit a smaller man, or take unfair advantage. He must never go back on his word. He must always tell the truth. He must be gentle with children, the elderly, and animals. He must not advocate or possess racially or religiously intolerant ideas. He must help people in distress. He must be a good worker. He must keep himself clean in thought, speech, action, and personal habits. He must respect women, parents, and his nation's laws. The cowboy is a patriot. I'm not sure that's the Code of the West, but it's a pretty good code.
That's not a bad code. Yeah.
Roger and Ned, I want to come to the two of you following up on that same theme. How do you characterize the relationship between myth and reality in the American West? And is it purely one of opposition, myth cast in contradiction to reality, or do you believe the two are intertwined as well?
I share Steve's kind of concern about the conflation of the mythic or representational West that we all have inherited through popular discourse and the experiential lived reality that characterizes so much of Western history. But I think they're connected in ways that we have to keep coherent in our thoughts and in our kind of understandings of the subject, partly because the imagined West is such a dominant representational component of the American national character and American history more broadly. I think one scholar has suggested that the American West is the most imagined region of the American historical landscape. And that imagination and that kind of representational pull has formed so many of our kind of understandings of our national selves in kind of broad ways and identifiable forms. Popular culture and various kinds of representational discourses are the most identifiable places we can see that. And those frames help us kind of enter into the landscape. But by and large, the vast majority of people who've lived through what we would call the West would not recognize these types of representational realities. I'm, for example, writing a kind of a project at the moment, and it kind of struck me in one recent notice that in the aftermath, for example, in the Trans-Appalachian West, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, after France has ceded, the vast majority of its Western Hemispheric holdings to the British Empire at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, that very few actual Native Americans had lost any land in that conflict. And it's just kind of like we've taught this history, and we continue to teach this history as one of territorial transfers, of kind of acquisitions and losses, of gains and subsequent ironies, because we all know that the British Empire did not last much longer after 1763. But the kind of lived experience, the reality of that period and of subsequent periods, is one in which peoples did not actually lose land. They simply had different traders and imperial agents and officials around them. There would be a transfer of land subsequently, about a half century later. But that kind of sense of kind of representational territorial aggregation that we just saw kind of projected on the screen is in many ways a kind of component of that representational form. We kind of have a spatial image of the West that isn't congruent with the actual lived experience of, say, dispossession. So there are many ways in which the kind of forms of representation or kind of imagined experiences of Western history are and are not tied to the lived reality of those who inhabited these regions.
Thank you. Roger?
Well, I would say on the Go to the West, it was really the ethos of the people who were in the West. However, Hollywood got a hold of it, and like anything else, Hollywood would romanticize, idealize, in a hyperbolic manner, exaggerate certain events to make them seem typical. And they were highly atypical. But we don't want to see, as Bill Koch said, we don't want to see the actual mundane, prosaic life of the cowboy. We want to see the anomalous things that occurred on the trail here or there. That's what makes a movie. That's what makes drama. So it's not where we're getting things that never happened or were unreal. We're just getting a preoccupation with the unusual, the extraordinary. I mean, that's what makes drama. That's what makes Hollywood. So it's not, I would argue it's not mythological. It's not something that never happened that came about entirely from people's imagination. It's a focus on the aberrational, the unusual, the anomalous. But that's what we want. You don't want the life of the cowboy taking care of sick cattle and mending fences and going to town once every 6 months and coming back with the clap. Okay, so that's not what we want to see. We want to see the stampede. We want to see the gunfight. We want to see all of this. And it's not that that didn't happen, and it's not that that's not true. It is. And so my argument would be more that what Hollywood has done is, as they do in every movie, is that they focus on these things that grab your attention and dramatize the events. We don't get history from that. History is very different. And as some of these on the panel know, I see the history as very tame and civilized most of the time. However, if you focus on young men intoxicated in a saloon late at night, then you will see deadly fights. Now, the average person in the Old West didn't experience that. If you weren't young, if you weren't issuing a challenge in a saloon, if you weren't intoxicated, if you weren't armed, you would not experience that. And so you take wild and woolly towns, well, most of those people in those wild and woolly towns experienced no kind of violence at all. And they're far more peaceful and law-abiding than nearly all American cities are today. And that was in the most rugged, adventurous, wild places in the Old West. However, if you were in the Shamrock Saloon and you were Alex Nixon and Tom MacDonald, true scene, who were arguing who would pay for the next round of drinks, and Alex Nixon, bigger and more powerful than Tom MacDonald, he took offense that it was Tom MacDonald said, "No, it's my turn to buy this round." And boom, down, oh man, I hit myself a little too hard there. And down went Tom MacDonald. Tom MacDonald stood up and said, knowing that he was smaller and Nixon was much larger and more powerful, and he said, "Will you give me," I should say, they're both Irish, you know, gee, that's surprising. And he said, "Will you give me even chances?" And Nixon said, "Yes, by God." And they both went for their guns. Boom, 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 boom. And they were both wounded. Nixon was mortally wounded. He died. Patrick Gallagher's Shamrock Saloon, 1878, Bodie, California. And that was real. And you put that in the movie. That might be one of the highlights of the movie. Now, was that something that happened every night in every town, regular, and that was the Old West? No, it wasn't. Most people's lives had nothing to do with that. But certain select people, like I said, young guys intoxicated, armed in the saloon late at night, that was reality for them. So that's what I would argue. You know, it's just a bit of a distortion and misrepresentation of what life was like for the average person in the Old West.
Patty, thank you. That's great. I even felt the punch almost. Patty, you're audaciously unromantic. You go.
Thank you. Thank you. I came just to hear such a compliment. That is such a...
Yeah, well,
You wrote
Okay.
this incredible book called The Legacy of Conquest.
Thank you.
And
Very credible is what you
It's
said.
incredible. And
Credible.
I've
credible.
actually read most of it. And
Oh, thank you.
I got to say that you do a fine job of living outside of the academy and helping people to embrace and understand history in a very unromantic but very realistic way. So yours is a bridge of pragmatism. 50 years ago, scholars within the academy wrote and talked a lot about the American character, and it was all around this almost kind of romantic notion of manifest destiny. And you help us to realize that not only cultural, but there are economic pursuits that are underway here as well. How do you profess and inform your students with a realistic understanding of the American West today?
Well, thank you, and I will probably take up some of the issues some of these folks have taken up. So the author of The Legacy of Conquest, which came out 31 years ago, the author of that book was not able to join us tonight because I am 31 years older. So the person who wrote that book has been through some transformations, and one of them is, I shall display that. Look at these boots, huh? And Western wear. So I didn't do that 31 years ago. So now I am wearing Western wear. This is a fringe, not a fringe, what is it? Well, anyway, it is Western stuff. And I am so trying to co-opt some of the stuff that I, 31 years ago, might have taken a more oppositional stance to. And I want to tell you a couple of stories about how the author of The Legacy of Conquest, who regrets not a thing about that book, how I just thought I might want to change some of my tone and approach. So I have two stories. One of them is from a gathering in Santa Fe of international scholars, probably 25 years ago, not long after Legacy had come out. And they were from everywhere. They were from Africa and Europe, all kinds of places in Europe, and China. And I had thought, oh, the people from China, that's been so recently that they have been open to American influence. They will not have been exposed to Western movies. Too late. So it is astounding how internationally appealing the Western myth is. So I had an idea after a week with these teachers and scholars from all around the world. I thought I will give a copy of The Legacy of Conquest to the scholar who can say that she or he was the most shaped and taken off course by exposure to the Western myth in their homeland and their childhood. So I will say this, I'm not stereotyping, but most of the contestants who stood up to say that they, as children, had been most shaped by the myth of the West, they were almost all from Germany and Austria. And what that means, I don't quite know, but I do know that they have Wild West towns. So these five guys speak about how they were so shaped by the West. And I'm about to give one of them a copy of The Legacy of Conquest, autographed, and suddenly, this is the moment that you're wondering, what is this story about? Okay, here we go. A woman from Poland. And remember, this is a story from 25 or so years ago, so she had grown up under communism in Poland. She suddenly says, I want to speak on this, she says. And then I should say that she had been to Acoma Pueblo a day or two before, and she knew what a kiva was, a sacred place. So this woman suddenly stands up and she says, Professor Limerick, you may tell me what you want to tell me about the West and the real West. I will tell you that I was a child in Poland in tough times, and Karl May, the person who wrote classic Westerns that everybody in that area wore. Karl May, she said, Karl May was everything to me. My father read Karl May Westerns to me when I was a child. Those moved me, those showed me a world of possibility. The first book I read when I could first read was a Karl May novel. She said, the first movie I saw was a Karl May movie, and the old Shatterhand was played by a fat Frenchman, but I loved him anyway. So she goes on and on about this, what this has meant. And then she says, so you may tell me whatever you would like to tell me about the American West and its reality. And I will tell you this, Professor Limerick, I will tell you, Karl May is the kiva in my soul. So that was a while ago, and I thought, do I have a life plan where I'm going to take something away from a woman who grew up under tough circumstances in communist Poland, and I'm going to say, oh, I'd give that up. If that gave you hope, the old Westerns, I'd really suggest that you lose even that. So that was a transformative moment of thinking I will probably need a different strategy. I didn't race out and buy the boots at that moment, but there was a move in that direction. Then the second story comes from Fort Lewis College in Durango. In about the same time period, I flew to Durango to give a talk at Fort Lewis College, and I had the New York Times Book Review with me. And on the inside front page of the New York Times Book Review was an extremely colorful ad for a book that was called, The Heart of the Country, I think, by a woman, Penelope Williamson. Very brightly lit Western sunset, and it said, it was quite a ridiculous ad, I thought. It said, could the young schoolmarm accept the love of a full Western man? And then at the bottom it said, Montana was not the only frontier. So oh, good Lord, what a ridiculous thing. So I took that I had that in my backpack, and then I went to speak to this group of students at Fort Lewis College, and I said to them, I said, I've been doing my best, and this is the point of this whole thing. I had done everything I could think of for a year or two to debunk the myth of the American West. So I say to these kiddos at Fort Lewis College, here is my book, Legacy of Conquest. Here is this novel, Montana is not the only frontier. And I said, I want you to rate these two texts by their influence over the American public and the chance of their shaping how people think about the West on a scale of 100. So the students said, we would give The Heart of the West, Montana was not the only frontier, we'd give that 99 points. We'd give Legacy of Conquest 1. So, don't speak at Fort Lewis College. They have a very wonderful policy of admitting Indian students, and that was not the particular. Well, who knows? Maybe I'm sure that shapes Fort Lewis College. Anyway, those two experiences made me think we're going to have to come up with something better in life. Yeah. So I have tried to be, I learned two-step dancing. That was not easy for an academic. You think academics take to two-step dancing? No, I had a friend who said, I do half-step dancing. I think, well, that's pretty funny too. So if you do two-step, that's pretty funny. So I feel that there's got to be a better route than that. Let's just say, here is reality, here is myth. You guys who believe in the myth, you guys are really, you're out of it. So I have tried to find ways, and this I guess would be the punchline of your getting to your question. I don't think I can say a word that would be useful about the American character because I am far too aware of how many different people participate in the creation of that, and I would feel I was dishonoring or disrespecting a bunch of them if I started talking about the American character. And I know, because I wrote this essay with Richard White, maybe write that essay, I know that the phrases about pioneers and frontiers, I know that when an African-American person of note passes away, it will sometimes say, important pioneer on the civil rights frontier or something like that. That will happen. I know that people of all kinds, I know that Indian people wear cowboy hats. I know that that is just an adopted symbol system. So rather than saying, could we just do fact checking, which isn't a very useful activity, could we do something that invites people into a conversation and then says, you know, the story, this is my dream, and it works mostly, to say, you know, the story is actually more interesting if you want to put the complexity into it. So if I could go back and visit with the Polish woman, who I can't, but if I could say, okay, Karl May, okay, he's a goofy person. He never had been to the United States when he was writing most of his. He'd never been to the West. Okay, he's goofy. Well, why would I start off by saying to the Polish woman, Karl May is a goofy person? No. Don't say, well, what was it that you liked so much about those novels? And then start from there and then ease into it's actually a lot more interesting than you knew. And invite her into a different form of, I don't want to use this term out of context, but a different kiva in her soul.
Steve, I want to go to you. I'm intrigued, following on that same pattern. You used a term, history of concord versus history of conflict, yes, or history of conquest. Could you say just a bit more about that?
So the book I'm working on now is entitled Can We All Get Along? An Alternative History of the American West. And actually, the book I most recently wrote was a book for this Oxford University Press series, these very short introductions, of which they have hundreds and hundreds of titles on all manner of subject. And mine was on the American West. So I wrote the American West, very short introduction. And these books are, this is a shameless plug now. These books are limited to 35,000 words. And I said, well, I can't do the American West in 35,000 words. It's such a complicated subject. And it's such a deeper, richer history. And it's not just the 19th century. It goes back. And, and I said, look, and they said, nope, 35,000 words. And they came back to me, and I pointed out that, or they pointed out to me that one of the titles in this series is The Meaning of Life. So I guess if you can do the meaning of life in 35,000 words, you probably should be able to get the American West down into 35,000 words as well. But I guess with Can We All Get Along, an alternative history of the American West, people have suggested, well, that's going to be a very short book. There's not going to be many stories of people getting along.
Oh,
but in
no.
fact,
Oh, yeah.
no, quite the contrary.
Yeah.
It is in some ways inspired by Patty's work. And it is not to sort of, I think, trying to whitewash or replace or erase that history of conquest, but to suggest that there is this alternative history, and it's not simply the alternative history of mundane activity. It's unexpected moments across the last 250 years in unexpected places where people who often had often been enemies of one another managed to get along, and tried to explain how it is that people managed to do so in those situations, and then why those situations typically fall apart, and how we remember or misremember or forget those. And then this is the final point I want to make on this. What we take away from the legacy of Concord, what lessons we can learn. And that, I think, gets to the values issue. Because again, and this goes back to the title of the panel, I don't think I would have titled the panel Values in Conflict, but I might have said, what's the value of Western history? Yeah. And in one sense, before Patty Limerick came along, not just Patty Limerick, but not just Patty Limerick,
okay,
but
no.
Before Patty Limerick came along.
Can I just say there are a giant number of footnotes and sources cited in my book, Legacy of Conquest. So it's Patty Limerick standing for, I don't know what,
Absolutely.
755 scholars. So.
But there was a sort of story that we told about the West, maybe mythic, that sort of was a powerful story that explained who we were and why the West mattered to who we were as a people and as a nation. And in some ways, Legacy of Conquest disrupted that story, disrupted that narrative. But one of the things I think we've struggled for in the aftermath is to figure out, well, what does the West mean? What does this story mean? If it's not the old story, the triumphant frontier pioneer story, what is the story that we take away? What is the lessons and the legacies? And I hope over the next couple of days, we wrestle with that question. And we think about what's the lessons. Both Patty and I are involved now with centers that are engaged in history and policy work. Trying to think about how do you take history and translate it into policy? What's the utility of history in that way? Most historians, I think, back away from that kind of conversation. They're not comfortable thinking about history as predictive or prescriptive, but they're also not comfortable with, I think, history or Western history as anything but a history of wrongdoing and bad thinking. And I think we're now wrestling and trying to figure out what does this history mean? What is it worth? And I hope, as I say, over the next couple of days, together, we can really think about that.
I just could like to quickly say that if you quantified this, and I'm sure I'm not a quantifier, and I wouldn't know how to do it, but if you quantified the number of human hours in the West in the 19th century, you would find that the percentage of time that people spent killing each other was very, very small. And you would find that the time they spent trading with each other, having interpreters and translators engage them in conversation, the time, I'm sorry to be so explicit here, the time they spent sleeping with each other and producing people of mixed backgrounds into that picture, you would so find that the numbers were so much on the side of things that were not matters of violence and mutilation and so on. So I take your point, Mr. Croak, that indeed the wars are big. The wars are very big, but the production of babies is also very big in that story too. So, well, he's into
Roger.
that now. So it seems like we've received his,
Roger,
we've got his
you're a
approval of that.
historian as well. You tell the story, and you do a wonderful job of telling stories and documentaries. How do you respond to this idea about how you curate history and tell the story?
Well, there's so many perspectives, and that's, I mean, that's a problem and it's a blessing. I mean, that's why we can have some debate and controversy and all these things. I mean, any historian brings an innate bias to the material. You know, it's not so much we argue facts, it's how you assemble those facts and how you interpret them. And what you come out with, and so in many, I think what was just said by Stephen and Patty and many other things were complementing each other, and yet maybe coming from different perspectives, but saying very much the same thing, that how life went on, you know, despite conflict. Despite all these different layers of development, conquest in the American West, life went on. And there was all these interactions, mutual interactions, and most of them peaceful. But where you come down with it, it's a question, who do you want to be today? You know, I tend to look at this. I mean, this gets into a larger kind of multicultural discussion. I tend to look at it from a more traditional perspective, you know, which might in the past been called the American perspective. I mean, that is what I am. That is what I see. You know, I see the pioneers coming westward. I see my people doing that. Well, that's not everybody's people doing that. And I can't force somebody into my perspective, but on the other hand, I can appreciate, but I can't adopt their perspective. I mean, that's not how I see that. I see that, you know, it's the transportation frontier, the pioneers coming west, settling the land, all these layers of development. I mean, that's how I see it. I see it in a more traditional sense. Now, does that work for the 20th century? No. And I enjoy the 19th century because for me, it was our Homeric era. You know, it was the Achaeans coming down through the Greek peninsula to the Peloponnesus or something, 1,000 years BC. I mean, that's what adds adventure and romance and a kind of vicarious thrill through history for me. Mm-hmm. And I can't argue that other people should feel that way and see things that way. And vive la différence, you know. And so that's what I enjoy, and it's impossible to resolve that and say, this is how history should be seen. And as Patty said, we can't say that, well, this should be the perspective, and this is, and for fear of saying, well, that's excludes somebody else, that's not inclusive. Well, it can't always be inclusive, you know?
Is it okay to have
Yeah,
a
yeah,
exchange
yeah.
here? I think you are doing a very bad disservice to a number of white people in the American West in the 19th century. I think you were writing them out of the story. I'm thinking of people like Josiah Royce, who in 1886 wrote a book on the conquest of California that was more critical than I would be about the American forces there. I am thinking you were doing a disservice to the person whose quotation I brought here, Phoebe Apperson Judson, who's settled in the Pacific Northwest in the 1850s, who, when she was 95 years old, she published a book about her time, and I'm going to quote just a few things that I think she needs to be in your story. She is a white settler. Listen to her. Indians, she's talking about some Indians who wanted to build, to put their camp near their cabin. How could those Indians realize they were trespassing on our rights when no doubt this area had been one of their favorite camping places and hunting grounds, as well as that of their forefathers for generations? The earth, what says, was with its haunts and trails had been as free for them to hunt and fish as the air they breathed, and we, in reality, were the interlopers. That's Phoebe Judson. That's not me. That's not somebody looking back and saying, oh, they should have thought that. And I would like to present to you Bishop Daniel Tuttle, a Methodist minister who
Someone's footnoting this, I hope, right?
Yes, I hope so. And he was a very bad, huge turf in the interior West that he had to cover as a Methodist bishop. He said, can you imagine, try to imagine this terrible experience. He traveled more than 40,000 miles by stagecoach. Think what it meant to ride in a stagecoach, and think of doing that for 15 miles. Well, he did that. So this is a story Bishop Tuttle tells about, he was a very good-natured person. Most times I enjoyed that mode of traveling. Many times I grimly endured it. A few times I was rendered miserable by it. One time he was rendered miserable was in 1867, the 19th century. He is not a white liberal of the late 20th century. He was on a stagecoach. A fellow passenger, by manner and act, was insulting to a colored woman in the coach. Bishop Tutler, he says in his book, Tuttle, firmly reproved him on that. When the passenger repeated the offense, Bishop Tuttle said, I shook him soundly, very soundly. And at the next station, the offender got out and slunk away from our sight. So the people, the white folks of the 19th century West were one complicated group. And to swoosh them into a homogeneous, here they come, they're coming west, they're not paying attention to anybody else, that is a disservice to my ancestors, I guess I'll call them that. I mean, so Roger, don't do that. If you want to say that you have a particular set of characters you like very much, okay, good. But the people of the 19th century West, the white folks, had very complicated attitudes. There are army officers. There's John Gregory Burke. There's all kinds of interesting army officers who felt horribly conflicted. I mean, John, what was his first name? I just forgot his name. George Crook had himself sued because he was a general, because he did not want to remove the Poncas and return them to a miserable place where they didn't want to live. He arranged, that general arranged to have himself sued so that he could not do that. So don't flatten the white folks of the 19th century West, unless you want to, because we have a country and it's a First Amendment country, so go ahead and flatten.
I don't know that I said that, and I didn't. I tell you the truth, I wouldn't argue with anything you just said.
Well, then don't say that you can't adopt the point of view of Indian people, or you can't adopt the point of Latinos or Mexican Americans. Recognize that you can do all that. You can do all that because Phoebe Judson was able to say, we are the interlopers. James Byrne, an army officer in Santa Fe.
I wouldn't argue with that.
Okay, so James Byrne was an army officer in Santa Fe in the 1860s or 1870s. He's walking along and he says, this is very irritating to me, he reminisces, because he tries to ask for directions, and the people in Santa Fe are Spanish speakers. And he's very irritated that he can't find someone to speak English with him. And then he writes in his diary, he said, what? I was the intruder. I was the one. So let's celebrate those.
That's a very good point, Patty.
We can all get along.
Yeah, I could see that.
Right.
If you don't mind, I want to turn from the white citizen. Ned, I want to come to you. In this alternative history, this kind of dialectical, Hollywood tells us or shows us the violence, but the alternative history helps almost to some degree erase or downplay the violence. And the buffalo and the American Indian slide off of the canvas.
John Gay.
You have written and spoken prolifically, and I watched a number of videos where you've talked about particular massacres that are defining moments in this American narrative. One in particular is the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. Could you just tell us a bit about that massacre and one or two other massacres that you focused on scholastically?
Yes, I can do that.
On that.
And the past is really a foreign country, and it's full of these surprising characters that enthrall us and present to us new images, ultimately, of not only themselves and their worlds, but perhaps even of ourselves and our world. And American Indians obviously occupy a particularly iconic space in this representational world, and this kind of mythic, and are in many ways the kind of anti-hero or the kind of antithesis of the kind of self-actualized masculine Western American subject. So in a kind of dialectical vision of kind of American subject formation, Indians play a kind of essential enabling role. And those types of representational understandings limit our ability to not just see the experience that American Indians had in the 19th century West or American history more broadly, but the complexity of that experience. And so there are sets of conflicts, sets of violent interactions, sets of wars that are hard to really summarize or make sense of in kind of short form. In 1864, in 1863, and 1865 are the years of the kind of crucible of America, the Civil War. And one could probably say more Westerners killed each other on the battlefields of the American Civil War than they ever did in the American West.
Yeah.
And I think of the presentation previously about mentioning Texans being gone kind of reminds us that there are these periods of undetermined historical formation in our nation's past that we're familiar with, but I perhaps don't recognize. We don't really understand the extent to which the Civil War fundamentally altered the future composition, not only of the American North and South, but obviously of the West as well. And there is a moment of really incredibly revelatory insight or understanding if one seeks to engage it. Particularly because many of the Union Army's most accomplished officers at the time of the outbreak of the American Civil War are from the South. Mm-hmm. And many of them return to the South in its defense or on its behalf. And they abandon American forts along the way. They migrate east. Mm-hmm. And the Indian peoples of the American West, who've been negotiating for 12 odd years or so since the end of the U.S.-Mexican War in places like Santa Fe or the Central Plains or in California, start looking around at this deteriorating American army and not believing the things that they've been told. And a number of kind of military conflicts that occur in greater New Mexico, one might say, in the kind of trans Rocky West and around the Southern Plains is really kind of remarkable. The Navajo Wars increase. We're going to hear a kind of biopic of Kit Carson tomorrow. Hampton Sides is here, author of Blood and Thunder. And there are sets of battles then from this period that involve incredibly complex individuals and forces. So many of the California, which has become a state in 1850, admitted to the Union for really only 10 years. Many of them are Irish immigrants and other relatively recent arrivals, immigrant community, Euro-American arrivals, either to the United States or migrants who are seeking kind of glory in battle themselves. Many of them joined the Union Army, and the Union Army places them in Western forts. So you have all these kind of glory seekers sitting in places like Camp Douglas, Utah, or Fort Lyon, Colorado, or looking for conflict. And Indian battles then become their kind of primary arena of engagement. And so the Satin Creek Massacre, which many of us in this room are familiar with, kind of emerges in the aftermath of a kind of deteriorating Union kind of capacity to enforce its own laws and regulations. At the same time, relatively very recent immigrant communities or settler communities have formed in places like Colorado, which before 1855 has hardly any English speakers in it, if you think about it. Santa Fe, the greater Santa Fe area probably has 100,000. New Mexico has about 100,000 inhabitants in 1860. And the Union Army is largely stationed in and around that region in the Southwest. And there are very few people in Colorado before the gold rush of 1858, 59 that Elliott West and others have written so much about. And so this is like a cauldron of incredibly dramatic historical dynamics. Tens of thousands of gold rushers settling in the Front Range gold fields. Interior Indian Ute bands around the parks areas into the regions of valleys around here as well. Many of whom are facing declining bison and other kind of game and economic resources. And Southern Plains and Central Plains communities, Cheyenne and Arapaho, trying to maintain kind of stable economies in this incredibly rapidly changing world. Those are the kind of conditions that create the kind of conflicts that we call massacres. And there's a complexity to them that, like with any military engagement, is not really evident or anticipated. So I've been involved in Sand Creek activities or kind of reassessments for some time, and have come to see this as a kind of particularly transformative kind of period. And I'm going to just briefly conclude with two individuals, both of whose lives were changed by the Civil War and by the Lincoln administration. Lincoln is from Illinois. He appoints a Methodist minister from Evanston named John Evans to be territorial governor of Colorado. The guy's never been outside of the region. He's settling in Colorado at a time when it wants to become a state. He's trying to manage this kind of political morass. Colorado, no offense, is not a kind of logical geographic entity.
That would be true.
You have these giant mountains, and I'm kind of in the western, third and half of the state, and these endless plains to the east. So, the settlers who are forming in Colorado Springs and in Denver, very few of them have any sense of what the kind of mountainous terrain looks like. So, they're navigating these kind of complex realities. And Evans is trying to kind of lobby on behalf of statehood at a time when the military is kind of trying to drag him into these conflicts, and he's telling Black Kettle and other Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders that your time will come if you don't follow these rules and stay on the reservation that's been established. And they're saying, you say these things, but they don't really ever are enforced. So there's this kind of turbulence of kind of multiple senses of reality and beliefs. I was going to mention my favorite Westerner from this period is a Missourian who travels west on one of these stagecoaches. And so your stagecoach metaphor remedy is really helpful. The stage is very uncomfortable to my favorite. And my tribe is in Nevada, the Western Shoshone tribe of Elko, Nevada. And Nevada has kind of adopted this Westerner as their most famous kind of pseudonym or known to author of notoriety. He's in their Nevada Writers Hall of Fame. He uses a kind of a pseudonym in Virginia City in 1863 for the first time. But he's really a Missourian named Clemens who comes across west because his brother has been appointed Secretary of the Nevada Territory in 1860 by the Lincoln administration. And Samuel Clemens spends 5 years during the American Civil War in the West, Nevada, California, and will end up in Hawaii at the end of the war, sent to cover the plantation economies that have been established there, leaving behind his Missouri divided homeland during its crucible. And so if we think of the West as distant from and removed from things like slavery and kind of the sectional crisis, if we think of Indians as separate from this like national crisis, we're not going to really understand these subjects. So this is a kind of I think a strong encouragement for deep engagement and perhaps some complexity of kind of encouraged some encouragement to think about these communities as inhabiting the same time and space, sometimes vying for resources, sometimes not, sharing and not sharing, and living a kind of complex reality that is still in many ways unformed. So that's kind of my...
Ned,
sorry.
that's a beautiful note to end on. Samuel Clemenson our Mark Twain, actually said that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes.
That's right.
And this past week, the African-American film producer Spike Lee was being interviewed about a documentary he's working on, and he confessed that the interrelatedness of history is such that he is now going to focus his energies on the plight of the Native Americans.
No.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Is that right?
And so this sense of we're all a part of this inescapable network of mutuality, that we're tied in a single garment, is underscored in the American West because it's about history, and history is our story. And so
I have one
these
last
great four
quotation.
historians tonight have helped us to realize that we
The word
can...
code.
You
The word
say that
code.
again?
I have a quotation from a
Give it
important
to us,
Coloradan,
Patty.
and it has the
Write
word
us out of
code
here with
fr-
this quote.
Okay, and it so ties in with your point. So I have, I was or may still be the state historian, and I had to read a bunch of essays written by high school kids for History Day, competing for History Day last weekend. And so the word code is on my mind because we have a panel here, Code of the West. And so I read a beautiful, these children, Colorado children, just writing beautifully, astoundingly. It was an amazing, I was writing the foreword for this little collection. And so Stephanie Reitzig, a Colorado high school student, wrote a paper about Ralph Carr. And Ralph Carr was the governor during World War II. And Ralph Carr, our governor, was repelled by the notion of the Japanese-American internment, and he thought it was wrong, and he spoke out against it, and he lost an election afterwards because of it. And when he gave his first statement to the Colorado people explaining why he was not going to support the federal policy of internment, the camp would go forward, but he would invite Japanese Americans to come settle in Colorado and be outside the camps. He gave that speech, and the phrase that he lingered on, and this is where the word code got a very fine resonance for me, and the student's paper was called this. Ralph Carr's phrase was the code of humanity, that he was charting his actions by the code of humanity. And I think that's a lot of what you were thinking of in that too. So that was the phrase I wanted to use there, and to say, you bet it's all knit together. You bet those things are.
This is our history. Four great historians, Ned, Patty, Roger, Stephen. Thank you very much for this. Thank you, Mr. Coates.